The phone woke me at 12:47 inches the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been lying awake anyway, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles in the dark, listening to the house settle around me the way old houses do. My wife Margaret had been gone 14 months by then, and the silence she left behind was the kind that pressed against your chest like a hand. I reached for the phone expecting nothing good. Calls after midnight never are. It was my son Daniel. Dad. His voice was low, tight in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy and something had gone badly wrong. "Are you in bed?" He hooby. "Are you in bed?" "I was trying to be," I said. "What's?" "Don't turn any lights on. Don't make any noise. I need you to get up very slowly and go to the back bedroom, the one at the end of the hall. Lock the door behind you, and don't open it for anyone until I tell you to." I sat up. My heart had already moved to somewhere higher in my chest than it belonged. "Daniel." "What on earth?" "Dad." He said my name like it was the only word he had left. "Please. I'll explain everything, I promise. But right now, I need you to do exactly what I'm saying, and I need you to do it quietly. Don't let anyone hear you moving around." "Who would hear me?" "I'm alone in the house." There was a pause that lasted precisely long enough to make my skin go cold. "You're not," he said. "I have lived 67 years on this earth. I grew up in a small town outside Ballarat, where men didn't speak about fear, just got on with things. I worked 31 years as a secondary school teacher and another 9 as a deputy principal, which means I have stared down enough teenagers in crisis to know when someone is genuinely frightened versus performing it. My son Daniel was not performing. I moved quietly down the hallway in my socks, slipped into the back bedroom, and turned the lock. I sat on the edge of the spare bed in the dark, phone pressed to my ear, and I listened to my son breathe from the other end of the line somewhere in Sydney, where he works for the Australian Federal Police. "Good," he said when I told him I was in. "Now stay there and don't make a sound. I'm going to tell you some things that are going to be very hard to hear." I thought about what was in that house with me. I thought about my daughter. I want to tell you how I got here, because it didn't start that night. It started the way these things always start, quietly, with love, with the best of intentions, or what looked like the best of intentions. Margaret passed in July of the year before. Ovarian cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end. She was 61 years old. She had dark hair she wore short, and a laugh you could hear 3 rooms away. And she had been the organizing principle of our entire lives together. Without her I was, to be blunt, a man standing in a kitchen not entirely sure where we kept the pasta. My daughter Renee came home for the funeral, as she should. She lives, or she lived, before everything in Melbourne, 3 hours by car. She'd been there 9 years, working in property management, and we spoke on the phone every Sunday and saw each other at Christmas and Easter and the occasional birthday. That's the honest description. We were close the way families are when there's no particular reason not to be, but not close the way Daniel and I are. Daniel and I are genuinely close. After the funeral, Renee stayed an extra week, then another, when she suggested she might work remotely from my house for a month, just to keep me company. Just while I was finding my feet, I said yes without hesitating. I was lonely in a way that felt physical, like a low-grade flu that never quite broke. The month became 2. 2 became 5. By Christmas, she had given notice on her Melbourne flat and moved her things into the spare room at the end of the hall, the same room I was sitting in now in the dark, and she said she didn't feel right leaving me alone and that she'd been thinking about a fresh start anyway, and it all sounded so reasonable that I accepted it with something close to gratitude. Her partner moved in 6 months after that. His name is Brett, and from the first moment I shook his hand in my own kitchen, I felt something I couldn't name and didn't want to examine too closely. He was friendly in the way of a man performing friendliness. He asked questions about the garden and the house and the suburb in the way of someone taking an inventory. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself I was grieving and suspicious and too old to be trusted with my own instincts. I was wrong about that last part. The first thing I noticed was the documents. About 4 months after Brett moved in, Renee brought some paperwork to the kitchen table one evening. While I was finishing a cup of tea, she sat down across from me the way she used to as a little girl when she wanted something. "Dad, I've been speaking to a financial advisor," she said, "and he thinks you really should have an enduring power of attorney in place, given your age and everything that's happened. It's just smart planning. It means that if anything ever happened to you, someone could look after things without a lot of legal fuss." I remember looking at the pen in her hand. "Who would hold it?" I asked. "Me. Obviously. I'm here. I know your accounts. I know everything. It just makes sense." I told her I'd think about it. She looked briefly, just briefly, like someone who'd been told a yes might be delayed. I didn't sign anything. But the conversation didn't end there either. It circled back, in different forms. Over the next 2 months, the financial advisor became a solicitor friend of Brett's, who could do it cheaply and quickly. The urgency increased incrementally, the way water rises when you're not watching. Phrases appeared in our daily conversation that hadn't been there before, that I seemed more forgetful lately, that I'd nearly left the stove on twice. I had not. That Margaret's death had clearly affected me more deeply than I was admitting, that I really should talk to someone. That last one was the one that landed strange. I have always had a good memory. Ask any of my former students. I used to know 300 names by the end of the first week of term, every year, without writing them down. I don't leave stoves on. I function well. I have, if anything, become more methodical since Margaret died because organization is one of the ways I manage missing her. But Renee said it enough times and with enough gentle concern in her voice that I began, and I am ashamed to write this, I began to wonder. I made a doctor's appointment. Dr. Halima Osei, who has been my GP for 12 years and whose opinion I trust completely. I told her, in a roundabout way, that my family was concerned about my cognition. She looked at me the way she looks at most things, which is very directly. "Who in your family?" she asked. "My daughter." "Not your son?" "No. Daniel hasn't mentioned anything." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Let's do a cognitive assessment, just so you have the data." I scored perfectly. She told me so in terms that left no room for interpretation. And then she said something I've thought about every day since. Sometimes, when we're grieving, we become vulnerable to accepting narratives about ourselves that other people find useful. I didn't fully understand what she meant until much later. The second thing I noticed was my own body. I have always slept badly, that's not new. But the particular quality of the tiredness I'd been feeling for about 6 months had a different texture to it. Heavy. Chemical, almost. I was sleeping 10 and 11 hours and waking up foggy in a way that didn't clear until midday. My thinking felt thick at times. I put it down to grief, to age, to the adjustment of living with other people again after decades of just Margaret and me. It was Daniel who first asked the question that unraveled it. He'd come up from Sydney for a long weekend in late autumn. I hadn't seen him in 4 months. And he is not a man who hides what he's thinking on his face. When I opened the door, he looked at me, and then he looked at me again, and he hugged me and said nothing. But I felt the particular quality of his stillness. That evening, after Renee and Brett had gone to bed, he sat with me in the kitchen. He asked how I was sleeping. He asked about my appetite. He asked whether I'd noticed any changes to my daily routine. Then he asked, very carefully, whether I was taking any new supplements or vitamins. I told him about the multivitamin Renee had bought me about 8 months earlier, Said I needed more support at my age. Said the doctor had mentioned iron. I took 2 capsules every morning with breakfast. He asked me where they were kept. I showed him the bottle on the kitchen bench. He picked it up and held it in a particular way, not looking at the label but at the capsules themselves through the translucent plastic. And then he put it down, and his face was completely still. "I'm going to take these with me when I go back," he said. "I'll buy you a new bottle from the chemist tomorrow. The sealed one, from the shelf." I asked him why. He said, "I just want to check something, Dad. Give me a couple of weeks." Daniel was not able to give me the details of what he suspected, and I understood enough about his work not to push. But what I know now is this. He had already begun, quietly, to have concerns that had started 3 months earlier, when he'd called on a Sunday, and I hadn't been myself on the phone, had said things in the wrong order, had confused a date we'd both been present for. He hadn't said anything to me directly, because he hadn't wanted to be wrong. He took the supplements back to Sydney. He had them tested through contacts he doesn't talk about in specifics. What was in those capsules, combined with small amounts in the herbal tea Renee had also begun buying for me around the same time, were not vitamins. They were a combination of substances that, in sustained low doses, produce cognitive fog, disrupted sleep, confusion, and a pattern of symptoms that can look very much like early-stage dementia. I'm going to let that sit there for a moment, because I think it needs to. My daughter had been medicating me. Slowly, deliberately, not to hurt me. Perhaps, though I'm not sure that distinction means as much as it once would have. To make me appear diminished. To build a case. To make the power of attorney, the sale of the house, the managed fund transfers, all of it looked like the logical and compassionate response to a father who was losing his grip. The house was worth just over $1 million too. The managed funds Margaret and I had built together over 40 years were worth another $600,000. Our superannuation, a share portfolio in a modest state but real, everything we had made, everything I had worked for, everything I intended to leave to both my children equally, was in the process of being transferred, systematically, to accounts I didn't know existed. Brett, it turned out, was not working remotely in property management. Brett had a history that a simple search would have surfaced, if anyone had thought to look. Fraud charges in Queensland, a civil suit in Western Australia, 2 aliases registered to businesses that no longer existed. He had done this before, though never quite so methodically. Renee had met him 18 months before Margaret died. I do not know, even now, whether my daughter sought him out or whether he found her. I do not know how much she understood of what she was participating in from the beginning, and how much she convinced herself was for my benefit. I have thought about this every single day since, and I have no answer that doesn't make something in me go very quiet. When Daniel called me at 12:47 that night, he had been working with colleagues in financial crimes for 11 weeks. The investigation had reached a point where an arrest was imminent. What he had discovered that afternoon, the reason for the phone call, the reason for the darkness and the locked door, was that Brett had made a series of calls earlier that day that suggested he knew, or suspected, that something was closing in. One of those calls had been to a number associated with a man who had previously been arrested for witness intimidation. My son did not know exactly what Brett planned to do, or when. He only knew that he wasn't willing to wait until morning to find out. I sat in the back bedroom with the door locked and my son's voice in my ear for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He talked to me about everything. About Margaret, about a camping trip we took when he was 9 that I'd half forgotten and he apparently had not. About the first class I ever taught, and how I described it to him once when he was studying for his HSC and terrified. He kept my mind busy and present, and I understood what he was doing, and I was grateful for every minute of it. At 3:37 in the morning, There was a knock on the front door of my house. Brett answered it. He was arrested in my hallway, in front of my daughter, by federal police officers, for fraud, financial abuse of an elderly person, and several additional charges I would only learn the full details of later. Renee was taken in for questioning. She did not come back to the house. Daniel arrived at my front door at 5:15. The sun was just beginning. He had driven through the night from Sydney, and he looked like it. I opened the door and I looked at my son, 41 years old, gray just starting at his temples, wearing the same jacket he'd had since he was 35, and I didn't say anything for a long time. Neither did he. He made tea. We sat in the kitchen until the light changed properly. The legal proceedings took 14 months. Brett pleaded guilty to 12 charges and was sentenced to 9 years with a non-parole period of 6. Renee, and this is the part I find hardest to speak about clearly, was convicted of 3 charges, including financial elder abuse and making false representations to obtain power of attorney. She received 4 years, with parole eligibility after 2. Her barrister argued, and I believe with some truth, that Brett had cultivated her, had introduced the scheme gradually, had framed everything as protecting her father rather than exploiting him. The judge acknowledged this in sentencing. It reduced the term, but did not eliminate it. I went to court on the day of her sentencing. I did not speak. I sat in the gallery, and I watched my daughter be led to the dock. And I thought about her as a 6-year-old making Christmas cards at the kitchen table, cutting the edges with those safety scissors with the orange plastic handles. I thought about Margaret. And what Margaret would have done with this. I thought about the camping trip Daniel described in the dark at 2 in the morning, and how we had all been there, all 4 of us, in a tent in the rain, laughing at nothing. A family is a strange and complicated thing. I am 67 years old. I still live in the same house, though it looks different to me now than it did. I have changed the locks, which is both practical and something more than practical. I go to see Dr. Osei every 3 months. I take supplements I buy myself, sealed, from the same chemist I've used for 20 years, and I open them in front of no one. Daniel calls every Sunday. He came up 3 weekends ago and fixed the gate I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years, and we had a barbecue and a couple of cold ones and talked about the cricket and about a trip we're planning up to Queensland in July. It is, in the specific and unremarkable way of good things, ordinary. I have not spoken to Renee. Her solicitor has written twice. I have not responded yet. I don't know what responding would mean, or what I would want it to mean. That question feels like something I need a little more time with. What I want to say. Before I finish, and I want to say it directly because I think it matters, is this. I was a secondary school teacher for 31 years. I spent 3 decades teaching young people to think carefully, to question what they were told, to examine the assumptions underneath the facts, and I still nearly fell for it. The fog crept in so gradually I barely felt it happening. The narrative about my own decline was built so patiently, one small comment at a time, that I had started to inhabit it. That is not a failure of intelligence. That is what sustained manipulation looks like when it is done by someone who knows you well enough to use your grief against you. So if you are older and living alone, please hear this clearly. Trust your own instincts, even when someone you love is gently suggesting you shouldn't. If someone in your family begins pushing for access to your finances or your legal documents, do not sign anything until you have spoken separately alone. Without that family member present to a solicitor, you have found yourself. Not their friend, not their recommendation. Your own. If your sleep changes dramatically without explanation, see your doctor. Tell them what you're taking and who gave it to you. If the people living in your home make you feel, slowly and consistently, smaller than you know yourself to be, that is information. Take it seriously. And if your phone rings at 12:47 the morning, and it's the voice of someone you trust, completely telling you to move quietly to the back room and lock the door. Trust that too. Sometimes love doesn't explain. It just moves you out of harm's way and talks to you in the dark until the sun comes up. I can tell you from experience that the sun does come up.